impose a little bit more of my teaching upon them. They're not as holy as the Vietnamese sisters, but they're definitely still my favorites. And then third, I love Catholic social teaching, and I love the way the church reflects on current political issues. So I've kind of been around the block theology-wise. I grew up Reformed. I worked for an evangelical campus ministry called InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. I went to a Methodist school to get my MTS, my Master's in Theological Studies. I'm Episcopalian, and I now teach at an Episcopal seminary. So I feel like I've seen a lot, and let me tell you, there is nothing better than the Catholic Church's reflections on political issues. I mean, this is a great treasure that the Catholic Church gives to other Christians. So anytime I get to engage with these questions and these resources, I walk away really nourished. And this gave me an excuse to read Fratelli Tutti, which I had not gotten to yet. So I was grateful for that as well. Though it's so good. Holy Father could have maybe had an editor a little bit, but just some great, wonderful things in there. So our question today is, can American Catholics vote for a third-party candidate? And we're going to start taking a historical approach. So here's the deal. When the Bible was written, and in the early church, no one was thinking, gosh, how should Christians vote in a representative democracy with a two-party system? This is not something that most Christians have thought about or even been an option on the table for most of the church's history. And so we're going to start off by just saying, well, what has the church taught us about the goals of politics generally? What is the point of governing authority? Then we're going to look at, I'm going to do a little constructive work, and we're going to look at two vices that I think contemporary Christians could fall prey to when they're thinking about voting for a third-party candidate. Then we're going to finally consider what would it look like for Christians to vote for a third-party candidate in a contemporary representative two-party democracy, and how can Christians decide, using the virtue of prudence, if this is the right choice. And you know what? I cannot, hold on. I want to clock myself, because what I really like about teaching is discussion and having questions. So I'm going to give a little lecture, but I really want to make sure we save time for us to discuss and the student brothers to argue with me, and really kind of dive into these questions together. So the slideshow is just going to really be some key points in text. Normally I would give this in a handout, but I want you all to see I'm not making up what I'm talking about. This is me still being a lawyer, as I like to kind of prove my point with the appropriate citations. So let's see, Troy, if you can move it to the next screen. New slide, please. Great, here we go. Okay, so how do Christians think about political power? What's the point of politics? And this is something that they had to think about in the early church. And of course, in the early church, they're living in a really different world than ours. They're living under an empire with a non-Christian emperor, where they are a tiny minority. And even in the early church days, in very early church in Jerusalem, they also are living under the religious authority of people who don't agree with all the claims of the Christian faith, the Jewish Sanhedrin. So early Christians had to say, well, why do we care? And what should we think about politics? And it's really interesting where they came down. I've got two scriptural quotations here for you. What the early Christians said about politics and about political authority is that political authority is given by God, and people who hold political authority have the power to control and command as long as they're acting for God's purposes. So in the book of Romans, St. Paul writes to the Christians in Rome, so the people living under this non-Christian emperor who's really corrupt, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except which God has established. Consequently, if you rebel against the authority, you're rebelling against what God has instituted. And if you're doing the right thing, you shouldn't be scared of the ruler. So there's this sense, there's this belief that political authority comes from God. However, political authority is not total. God doesn't give the political authorities the ability to say whatever they want. Rather, political authority can never contradict God's authority. And we see this coming up also in the early church of the book of Acts, when Peter and the other apostles are brought before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish governing authority, and they say, they told them, don't teach in Jesus' name. You're spreading a lie. Jesus wasn't raised from the dead. And they said, we can't obey you. We have to obey God rather than men. We can't stop teaching in Jesus' name. So we have this tension between saying authority comes from God, it needs to be respected, it needs to be taken seriously, but you cannot obey it if it contradicts God. So this is what Christians are thinking about when they're under this imperial power in the very early days of the church. And these two ideas lay the foundation for Christian approaches to politics. So authority is from God, it can be used for good, but if it's not used for good, you shouldn't obey it. So let's go on to our next slide. Okay, so we have this idea, it's intended, a political authority, like I said, is intended for God's purposes. But what are God's purposes for political authority exactly? So we know that the political authority can't tell them to stop preaching the gospel in Jesus' names. So one of the greatest theologians of the church, St. Augustine, wrote a really big, thick book called The City of God, in which he reflects on this. And he says, how should Christians think about the proper ends of political authority? And in a really famous chapter, he talks about this idea that all of creation has two cities, the city of God, which is the church, and the city of man, which is the political authority. And he said, look, these two cities have different goals. One goal is relationship with God in heaven. The other is promoting kind of natural goods, but to a certain extent, they share commitments. And these commitments are promoting peace and promoting justice. And so Christians, those in the city of God, need to work together with those in the city of man, those in the secular government, to promote peace and ensure justice, to make sure that people have the things they need for their everyday life. So we see this development on scripture that through this theological reflection that, okay, we obey the authorities as long as they promote God's ends, which means peace and justice, the things people need to live flourishing lives in their day-to-day interactions. All right, new slide. But we have to be really realistic about what this power can achieve. We have part of Augustine's idea about the city of God and the city of man is like, the city of man can't get us all the way there. It can't get us to relationship with God. And we see this idea coming up again in my favorite Dominican, St. Thomas Aquinas. And St. Thomas Aquinas writes about laws, and he says, when we're thinking about the political authority working to achieve justice, we got to remember human laws can't do everything. They can't point us to salvation. Rather, they can only forbid the major vices, the worst things people can do, the things for which it's possible for the majority to abstain, and things that are going to hurt other people. So we have to be realistic. St. Thomas is a great realist. He's very aware of the limits of the possible. So we want to work with the secular government for peace and justice, but we have to be aware that as we're working, there's a lot of things that people without the grace of the Holy Spirit can't do, or our culture doesn't fit us for, and we really should focus on preventing the things that are going to hurt other people. So this is what working for peace and justice looks like, being aware of the things that are going to hurt other people. So he's writing in the 12th century this is under a Christian ruler in the midst of Christendom, and he's still saying there's a limit to what the government can achieve, and be aware of this as you're working. He's now writing to Christian rulers and people who are involved in government. Be aware, think, what's actually possible for the political in order to promote this type of peace and justice. All right, new slide. So this is key for St. Thomas, it's key now. If you start thinking that politics can do too much, you start confusing your identity as a Christian with your identity as a citizen. You have to be careful as you're working with the secular authorities to work for this limited version of peace and justice, that you don't start to say, well, being an American is the same thing as being a Christian. Being French is the same thing as being a Christian. Being Italian is the same thing as being a Christian. No, our identity as a Christian comes first. And this is a quote from Gaudium et Spes, which is a document from the Second Vatican Council that really lifts up Christian political involvement, but reminds us that the church is present in all times, all places, all cultures, and people are called to serve, but that they also have to always make their identity as a Christian primary. So you're working for the secular good, you're being realistic about what that can achieve, and it is more important that you are a Christian than that you are a citizen, and it's more important, take it to today, that you are a Christian. That determines your beliefs much more than affiliation with any type of political party. So we're going to talk about third-party voting, but I do think Christians are called to be third-party thinkers. We're called to think and ask, what does the church teach us? What does scripture teach us, rather than what is my identity as part of a political party? All right, new slide. So as Catholic social teachings developed, as we moved to the contemporary world, and we've started to have representative democracies, one of the great things the church did in Catholic social teaching is to start saying, well, look, there's actually, in a certain sense, a lot more that people can do through a democracy than they could do through a monarchy. Christians, we can expand a little bit what this notion of peace and justice was. I mean, in Thomas Aquinas's day, your idea of peace and justice is making sure people get food during a famine, and that the robber baron down the road doesn't just sweep in and kill everybody. So there's a greater sense of what can be achieved. And so as we move into the last 100 years, as Catholic social teachings developed, the church says, look, one of the things that the gospel calls us to is to think about the poor and the weak. As we're talking about justice, as we're talking about peace, we have to prioritize what is going to be just for the poor, what is going to be just for the weak, what is going to provide for them the most. So that's how we sort of rank how we think about peace and justice. So realistic about the culture, but with a greater demand for care for the poor, greater demand for taking care of the weak. All right, next slide. So we have this framework. How do we think about voting, and how do we think about voting for a third-party candidate? I just said, I think we're called to be third-party thinkers, but does that mean that we vote? So a lot of times when people are voting for a third party, I think they're voting for a third party for one of two reasons that don't line up with the church's vision of what politics should be about. They have fallen into what I'm going to call a political vice. And there's two political vices that might drive people to vote for a third party. The vice of moral resignation, I'm going to call it, and the vice of moral idealism. And both of these run contrary to what Christians think politics should be about. So next slide. So moral resignation. You know what? My vote's not going to matter. I'm just going to throw it away. Who cares? Or that's one approach. That's kind of the millennial approach a little bit, like whatever. We have the sectarian approach, which was the person who says, you know what? As a Christian, I'm only going to focus on the church, and how I engage with the politics doesn't count. So why does my vote matter? Why should I spend time thinking about this? I'm just going to vote for a third party and be done with this. So this is these are the vices of the vice of moral resignation. And I think this is really problematic given this view of what the point of politics. So new slide. So first, scripture teaches us that Christians are responsible for engaging in civic life. Remember the quote from Augustine that we're supposed to be working with the earthly city to promote peace and justice? In Jeremiah, when the Jews are carried off to Babylon, I mean, not only are they under a non-Christian king, a king who doesn't know God, they're actually been captives and their whole town has been burned. Jerusalem's been burned. And God, speaking to the prophet Jeremiah, says to them, hey, plant roots here, be engaged here in Babylon, build houses, plant gardens, take wives, have kids, seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you. If God is telling the Jewish people to like settle down in the city that's taken them captive and destroyed God's temple, and to take all these big steps, I think God expects us to take the little step of thinking seriously about our votes and not being captured in moral resignation and giving up. And then we see in Galatians, Paul writes to the people in the church of Galatia, just because you're worn out on a bad political system doesn't mean you get to give up on your civic responsibility. He says, let us not become weary in doing good. Let us try to do good to all people. Voting is about the easiest way you possibly have to do good. I mean, assuming that you have a way to get to the polls or can vote by mail. But like, this is a pretty easy standard given of what the early Christians are being called to. So we can't just give up and not think our vote matters. All right, next slide, please. So in Catholic social teaching, we see this explicitly, that Christians are supposed to take an active role in government. We see this in Pacem in Terris by John the 23rd, keeping in dignity with human persons, take an active role. Again, going back to Gaudium et Spes, it says Christians actually are supposed to be a shining example in the political community by their sense of responsibility and dedication to the common good. We should look at these civic tasks as a chance to show people how seriously Christians take the natural good, how seriously Christians take politics. So maybe they'll think about how seriously we take the supernatural good, how seriously we take our relationship to God. So there's this sense that even if voting feels hopeless, even if you feel like it doesn't matter, we can't give up. And for a lot of people, voting for a third party looks like just giving up. This is the vice of moral resignation. Sorry, I'd originally said abnegation, but I changed it to resignation, but I didn't catch that slide. All right, new slide. So, Pope Francis, in fact, and this is from Fratelli Tutti, the new encyclical, and what he does in Fratelli Tutti is he takes the parable of the Good Samaritan, and he basically says, every action we make, every choice, every decision means that we are playing some role in the parable of the Good Samaritan. We don't get to step back and say, well, this decision doesn't count. You are always either the robbers, the Jewish man beat up by the side of the road, the priest, sorry guys, the scribe, the Levite who walks by and doesn't care, or you're the Samaritan. Every decision you make, you're playing a role in this story. And so Christians should always be asking, what is everything in our power we can do to care for our neighbors? And thinking seriously about our votes, not just giving up. I think that's exactly into this. Are we just going to walk by and say, well, there's nothing I can do today? And I think Pope Francis would say no. So this is a political advice. And by the way, this can be third-party voting or just not voting at all, which is what I know a lot of people can tend to do. So we can't get stuck in this when we're thinking about our votes. All right, new slide. So the other vice, which is the opposite extreme, is moral idealism. We can say, not that my vote doesn't matter, but you know what? Politics is so dirty. It is so yucky, and both sides are so corrupt. I don't want to be morally dirty by voting for either. So I'm just going to step back. Or we can fall into the trap of looking at a third party that doesn't have all the well-documented issues that the two major parties both have, and say, well, look, this party, the Green Party, or whatever it is, whatever it is, they're actually pure, so I'm going to vote for them. A lot of times that means they haven't had time to show us all the ways they're going to mess up like the other two parties have. So we can fall in this vice of moral idealism and expecting too much from the political parties, too much from the political process. So let's go on to the next slide and see the problems with moral idealism. So part of the problem is that we're not asking what politics for, and we're viewing it what Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great German Lutheran theologian, would call an ultimate activity as opposed to a penultimate activity. And I love this parable from Matthew, or not parable, this teachings of Jesus, where the they're trying to trap them. And they basically want them to say, well, don't pay taxes because the Roman government's corrupt. And the Roman government was super corrupt. And he still says, pay your taxes, give to Caesar what's Caesar's. Even though the political process is corrupt, participate in it in as much as you can. But remember, you're always giving to God what is God. Again, this point that like our Christian identity comes first, but there is a call to engage, even when we know it's a dirty, corrupt, and broken process. So let's go to the next slide. Moral idealism can look like a misunderstanding of the relationship with the church, between the church and the state. I love this quote from Pope Benedict in Deus Caritas S. We can get confused that the state's supposed to be just like the church, not that the church in its temporal manifestation is always pure, perfect, and efficient, but we can get confused and think, well, because the politics is so dirty, we should just take the most pure route possible. That's confusing the church and the state. And Benedict is reminding us the church can't be confused with the state, but we also can't remain on the sidelines. The church shouldn't stand on the sidelines, and definitely individual Christians shouldn't, even while we're keeping the church and the state separate and their roles separate. All right, next slide. So this is from, I didn't listen to the slide. This is from the document that you'll probably have seen already a lot in this series about forming consciences that the USCCB put out in 2015. And what they remind us, what politics is they describe it as the art of the possible. It is a gradual process where we ask what change is actually possible. What can actually be improved? And this, of course, goes back to, remember, Thomas Aquinas' point about laws, too, that we can't make laws that are better than the virtue of the most people. And we can't make laws that try to forbid everything beyond people's moral capacities. So they're reminding us politics is the art of the possible. This is a gradual process. We can't, if we get trapped in moral idealism in determining how to vote, we can't. We're expecting too much of politics. We have to see politics for what it is. And so they want us to think about this as we determine how to cast our votes. All right, next slide. So what I'd like to argue is if, and I guess in any decision about voting, but specifically voting for a third-party candidate, we have to exercise the virtue of prudence. And the virtue of prudence is a capacity that we can develop with God's help and with practice at ascertaining reality and determining what to do. So we have to, prudence enables us to look at the world, see it as it is, understand what God wants the world to be, and determine the best way to get from the reality we ascertain to the reality that God desires. And we'll never get all the way there. Prudence realizes this. So a person deciding to vote for a third party, or really vote in any way, has to look at the situation, the reality of the situation, look at where we fall short of the common good, look at how both parties fall short of the common good, and then assess, would my voting for a third party do something concrete to advance the common good, to affect real change, or would it be better if I voted for one of the morally complicit, flawed major parties? So this is the exercise of the virtue of prudence. Discerning the facts, understanding God's call, and then figuring out the best way to get there. And so Christians, as we decide how to vote, should be working on developing this capacity. So what does this look like? One thing it looks like is not getting caught in any type of media silo. How can we know the reality of the world if we're only hearing one point of view? It looks like talking to people who disagree with us. Catholic social teaching, remember the emphasis on the poor. It especially looks like hearing the voices of the poor and the weak. All of us have the time at 6 p.m. on a Sunday night to be on a Zoom call. This means that there is an extent that none of us are poor and weak. So we have to specifically determine the reality of the poor and the weak, and then ask, what is the step to take with my votes to advance the common good and justice for the poor and the weak? Determining developing these habits, developing this virtue. All right, next slide, please. And that's, by the way, from Josef Pieper. And if anybody here wants, if you don't have any theological background, if you ever want to learn more about the virtues, I will just do a little plug. He wrote an amazing little 120-page book on the virtues that is delightful. So I would recommend going to read this. So when did people vote for a third party? I think according to the virtue of prudence, American Christians. So in 1854, there were two political parties. There were the Whig Party and the Democrats. And the Whig Party was in the Northeast. It was the historical party of the mercantile capitalist in the Northeast, and opposed to slavery, but willing to compromise. And then you had the Democrats, who were the party that was primarily in the South, this party of the slaveholding states. And so in 1854, a number of the people who were part of the Whig Party and a number of kind of existing third party abolitionist parties split the Whig Party and started a third party called the Republican Party. They had an exceptionally good infrastructure, so good, in fact, that in 1856, 2 years after the party was founded, their candidate for president won multiple states in the Midwest and the Northeast. And in 1860, they elected the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln. So the people who voted for the Republican Party in 1854, or 1856 and 1860, exercised the virtue of prudence in two ways. They discerned what the good that God had intended, which was to oppose slavery in any practical way they could. And they discerned that voting this way would actually advance the common good, because the Republicans were able to really change society because they had brought together a lot of groups. They'd formed a coalition that actually worked. So the virtue of prudence in voting for a third party is demonstrated here. Discern the good, and they figured out the best way to get there. Of course, it led to Civil War, but the Civil War led to the end of slavery. So you could see how this would have been a really hard choice to vote. And when the Republican Party was formed, the Democrats in the South actually started saying this is going to lead to civil war. So this was a really hard decision to make, but this was an exercise of the virtue of prudence, thinking about politics as the art of the possible, a party that actually had the capacity to change politics to advance the common good. So let's go on to my next slide. So I want to highlight this for you. This is, again, the USCCB document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. They don't talk about third-party voting in this, which I think is interesting. But they give us an example of thinking about politics as the art of the possible. So they say, when all candidates hold a position that promotes an intrinsically evil act, the conscientious voter faces a dilemma. They're very clear earlier in the document. They list out intrinsically evil acts. I hate to break it to y'all. Both political parties on their official platform support what the church describes as intrinsically evil acts. So they say you may take the extraordinary step of not voting for any candidate, which is interesting. So they're very clear this would not be the normal approach. It is more normal that you would vote, but you decide after careful deliberation to vote for the candidate deemed less likely to advance such a morally flawed position and more likely to pursue other authentic human good. So this is the example of the virtue of prudence I was talking about. You might not vote. I think that we should read in voting for a third party candidate in there, that this is an extraordinary step, because your question is, how do you vote? Your question is, which candidate is less likely to advance such a morally flawed position and more likely to pursue authentically human goods? So you're doing this very careful balancing according to the virtue of prudence. Both parties are complicit. Both parties promote intrinsically evil act, and you decide based on this careful calculus. So that is where I think the bishops are calling us to. It's another great document. I'd really recommend reading it if you haven't already and spending some careful time assessing it. And I think it does teach us to think like third-party voters, but not necessarily to vote that way. So I am went a little longer than I wanted to, but we still have plenty of time for people to argue or discuss. And non-Dominicans on this call, the Dominicans have no compulsion about arguing with me. So I would really like y'all to, feel free to argue and push back too. We have to empower the laity in the church. So,
Thank you very, very
Oh,
much, Elizabeth. That was excellent. Thank you. Since our numbers are manageable, I'm just going to say if you have a question, of course, be respectful. We don't want people talking over one another, but I think you all have control over your mutes. Just to unmute yourself and pose your question or your comment to Elizabeth directly. Everybody okay with that?
all right, Kathy, I just saw you unmute. Did you have a question? And then we'll go to Father.
No, not right now.
All right, Father Michael.
Actually, I do, Elizabeth.
You
It's in a way, how would you assess somebody who would vote in for a write-in candidate? In some ways, their position would be even weaker than the third-party candidate. Would that be correct according to your
yes, I think that's absolutely
analysis?
Right. Yeah, you can pull the PowerPoint down now, Troy. Thank you. You were so great with that. I mean, because I think that does fall pretty clearly into to me, the vice of moral resignation, that you've just decided my vote doesn't count. It doesn't matter. So I'm just going to kind of throw it away, as opposed to voting. I mean, this is why I use the Republican example. That was a feasible third party.
If I might just add a very quick follow-up question. I was thinking of it as you spoke of the vices of at the present time. Might there be any virtues of third-party candidacy as opposed to the vices that might be connected to?
Absolutely. Look, I think, again, this going back to my example of the birth of the Republican Party. They had two virtues. They were very clear about opposing an abhorrent evil, the evil of slavery, and they were practicing. I mean, I guess I'd say they displayed the virtue of prudence, because they both opposed the evil. They saw the situation. They saw what God's calling was, and they figured out the best way to achieve it, and that they were effective. They were able to put together a platform and a coalition that actually challenged the reigning two-party system of the Whigs and the Democrats. And they were able to do it really well. So I would say that to me, that would look like a virtuous third party.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if y'all don't know this. So do y'all remember, I don't think, Father Michael, we never talked about this. So y'all remember Ross Perot's candidacy? Mm-hmm. So I grew up Ross Perot was a member at my home church. So I grew up sitting behind Ross Perot in church pretty regularly, the ears. And I mean, maybe, I can't, I mean, I was pretty young then. I can't remember exactly if he had like a compelling platform, but like that actually that was the third party that actually got some traction. But it was still kind of built around a person. So I would say, I think the exemplification of the virtue of prudence is both discerning the good and figuring out a way to actually achieve it, as opposed to kind of a quixotic crusade, which I do think goes against politics as the art of the possible.
Thank you.
So thank you. It's a great question.
Yeah.
I mean, so can I go?
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
But if we think about prudence as like identifying the means to accomplish the ends, right?
The ends, identifying the end properly, and then the means.
Identifying the ends and the means to get there. Yeah.
Right.
I guess, could there be an argument for voting for a third party based not on accomplishing the ends via the actual election in question, but via how could a vote, I mean, any of the above, right? Not voting, writing somebody in, voting third party, that action impact the actions of parties down the road such that they try to win your vote in the future. So the Ross Perot might be a great example.
Right.
Because he probably identified a hole that said, who are sort of broadly conservative people who are sick of this NAFTA stuff, who would be of a more protectionist mindset. It wasn't him, but 20 years later, that was the president we got. You know what I mean?
And I think the question you have to ask in that is, you know, is the current political moment a place where like 20 years is enough? I mean, that a 20-year sort of long-term plan. I mean, that was really interesting to me, actually, when I was doing the research on the Republican Party, the fact that this was a 6-year period. But they also realized, I mean, the reason they were so urgent about this is in 1854, President Pierce signed a bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened Kansas and Nebraska up to be slave states. And so they realized if we don't act now, and if we do not achieve right now, there will be so many slave states that there never will be a chance to basically get a coalition to oppose slavery. So they were very aware of the timeline, and they were very aware of kind of the cost of waiting.
Well, and their two-party system was 25 years old. Ours
That's-
is 160 years
Yeah,
old.
well, wait, or is that what your math is? Yeah, you're right. It's 160 years old.
You know what
But
I mean?
and it was,
So,
but they were still. I mean, it was still a big thing.
Elizabeth, I'm curious, thank you for this, really thought-provoking. I'm curious if you see any signals in what's happening within the current Republican Party of, the potential for, a third party emerging amongst that as you think about what have been more maybe traditional Republicans as opposed to the Tea Party Trump Republicans. Right. It seems like there's sort of a battle happening within that particular party. And to the extent even that people are advocating for the opposite party.
Like the Lincoln Project.
Like the Lincoln Project. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm really intrigued by that. It's definitely not on the ballot now. What I wonder, and this is total speculation, is if Trump loses, I think there's going to be a real reckoning within the Republican Party. I think there's going to be a lot of people who are pretty clearly have kind of sold out traditional Republican ideals for power. And I think that they're, look, I'll just lay my cards on the table. One of the things that makes me really mad about the Republican Party is I think they use Christians. And I think that there have been people in power who've had this idea that if we kind of throw out a couple of pro-life things and some religious liberty things, we can placate Christians. And I don't believe that everybody actually shares those convictions. And so I think that as they see sort of that there's not like this unified Christian voting bloc, I think that that's going to affect how the Republican Party thinks. So I will be really interested to see if a viable Republican third party emerges. Maybe someone like Mitt Romney, someone like Ben Sasse of Nebraska could be kind of a voice of that. But I think the problem with power is that I think it's really hard. They're not going to split when they're the party in power, when they're the party that hold the Senate. Mm-hmm. I will say one more thing. Actually, I was having this really interesting conversation with my dad, that this calculus of prudence looks different depending on which office you're voting for. So the president obviously has a lot of executive authority. So sort of the person of the president is really important. If you're voting for someone in the House of Representatives, there's a lot of people there. And so maybe the individual vote is matters in a different way than the president. If you're voting for someone on the local level, to an extent, up until recently, really, kind of national politics didn't impact, who your mayor was, like what your mayor's policies was, because your mayor isn't deciding on these kind of key points. So I think that being aware of how power sits in these different offices means, for example, if I were to vote for a third party candidate for my city council, like that could be that could affect real change. I live in Dallas County, which is a huge county, but I think there's not many people who vote for the city council. So you have a unified third party campaign for a city council seat. That becomes a lot more feasible. So that's another thing I want to just add as you're, kind of thinking through these kind of political realist questions. Yeah, Michelle, I'm really curious as to what's going to happen after this election, and the folks with the Lincoln Party, the Lincoln Project, I think are doing some interesting stuff. Mm-hmm. Other questions?
Yep.
I haven't heard from
Father
Patrick.
This goes back really in a way to your very first comments. there's an opinion writer, Elizabeth Brunig,
Yes.
and she wrote a piece a couple weeks ago about what's happened to the Catholic vote.
Mm-hmm.
When John Kennedy was elected in 1960, he got 82% of the Catholic vote. And there was a concern among a great many people in the United States that electing a Catholic was going to mean that we're going to elect somebody that's to the church, beholden to a foreign power in the Pope. And so Kennedy succeeded in not eliminating those concerns, certainly diminishing them to the extent that he was able to get elected. But also, and they were quoting a rather famous speech that he made in Houston at the time.
At Rice University.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's right. That he foresaw a time when this was not going to be a concern anymore. But in a way, and what the Elizabeth Brunig article points out is that that's too bad.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I was reading, and I was talking to some of my brothers about this, when I was reading Fratelli Tutti, I was thinking, wow, as Catholics, we really do have something different to offer. And yet we have become assimilated in a way that has diminished that. And she closes with this, and I'm just going to quote this at the very end of her article. Perhaps Catholics have earned the right to no distinction, the privilege of blending seamlessly into the social and political landscape of the United States, the freedom of having no special moral obligations. And what a wide, barren, featureless liberty it is.
I love that. Yeah, and you know, she's a convert, which is interesting.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I follow her on Twitter. She's a Roman Catholic convert. I think that's exactly right. And this is, look, I mean, folks, if y'all take away one thing from this, from someone speaking from outside the church, what Catholic voters should be offering is a radical rebuke to both parties and to the status quo in America and to the culture of conspicuous consumption. I still think you need to vote in a way, being realistic about the common good. When I started teaching Catholic social teaching at Aquinas, I remember I said on the first day of class, one of the great gifts of Catholic social teaching is that it calls us to transcend anything that we view as American political identity and to offer a radically different witness and a rebuke to everything we assume. And I include this to mainline Protestantism, and a witness from the outside of how complicit we all have become in this system that is not. We've forgotten what Augustine tells us to think about the relationship between the city of God and the city of man. We aren't supposed to be members of the city of man. We can work together, but it has to be something radically different. I think you're right, Father Patrick. You know, JFK, in a certain sense, it was such a big step forward, but it also was a sellout. I mean, talk about someone who, even just sort of the optics of that presidency, the beautiful wife, the really handsome president, you know, living out this vision of the American dream. And Catholics aren't about the American dream. We're about God's coming kingdom. So, Father Brian, I can kind of see lurking. Other folks.
Brian, are you lurking?
He may have gone, but I saw him as a audio participant. I pulled up all the audio participants to make sure that no one had other comments. Brother Jordan?
Still here.
There's Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the Republican example because I think it's really anomalous in some ways. And I mean, the Whig Party was collapsing, and so the Republican Party really emerged to take this space.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Michelle's
point,
like, who knows?
Right. Who knows? I think a lot of times in American history, the third parties have existed to pull one of the parties in one direction. Yeah. I would argue that's the whole reason for the Green Party's existence today, is to pull the Democratic Party to the left.
Right.
And I mean, I'm from Wisconsin, where President Trump won by about 20,000 votes in 2016, and the Green Party got 30,000. And so the Democratic Party fought very hard to keep the Green Party off the ballot in Wisconsin this year. So, you know, you beat them one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
But No, I mean, I think in considering the third party vote, right, it's a lot of,
Solidarity Party's on the ballot this year because I know some people who are voting for them, and I got in an argument Sunday night with Father Kroll as well about this.
what was that?
When I was out with Father Kroll and some other Jesuits on Sunday night in Wisconsin, they were, some of them were voting for the American Solidarity Party, and I rehearsed the talk to prove them that they were all wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's right. That's the big decision is, will a vote get noticed if it's for a much more minor third party?
Right.
Fourth or fifth party, if you will.
And this is to Brother Peter's point too. I think we have two questions. Will a vote get noticed? And is it worth sacrificing? I mean, what's your time horizon? Is it worth kind of playing the 20-year long game? Or is it the situation in such crisis right now? I mean, so I think, and that's again the discernment of virtue of prudence. That's where prudence comes in, is that you have to ask all these questions. But you're right. I mean, that can exactly be, and I think this is what we have to decide is the Green Party example is really good, is the degradation of the environment and moving the Democrats to the left such an overpowering consideration that you can kind of let the rest of politics play out as it plays out. And people of the Green Party probably would say yes. Catholics are called to really care about the environment. We're also called to, I mean, y'all are called to really care about other issues as well. And that's in that great document by the bishops, they kind of go through and really work through that in a very lovely way. I am the person who's been posting excerpts from that on my neighborhood Facebook page, so y'all can see how cool I am. All right, Father Brian.
We can't hear you, Brian. You're on mute.
There, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Question for you, maybe a little provocative in some ways. It's not really your context at all. But, you know, I'm thinking about this as a religious priest. And I remember reading a lovely article by Grant Kaplan about the promise for the vow of celibacy being in some ways a means for making sure that Catholic clergy are able to remain at a proper objective independence from the mechanisms of the state and so forth. We also have the historical example of the church coming down on missionary priests, especially taking up political positions and that sort of thing within various governments. This all tells me, especially when I'm considering, you know, Jesus's own teachings about us not having a home in this world, all these sorts of things, right? As a religious priest, do I have an obligation to vote? Or in fact, do I have a positive obligation not to vote?
I'm so glad you asked this question. And, you know, remember, I do go to bed every night with the religious priest, so it does come up in my context.
Well, you go to bed with the priest, and
yeah. You're right. So anyway, so my 3-year-old actually just asked as we were driving on Friday night, he said, Daddy, when do we get signs like everyone else? And he is at 3, he's picked up that everyone else has yard signs and we don't. And so my husband tried to explain to him about why it would be, he couldn't put a yard sign in our front yard because he has a responsibility to the people in his parish. And he has to be able to be, he can't, if he endorses either party, half the people in the parish will no longer feel like they can kind of trust him and come to him with issues. So that being said, I actually do think you're exactly right, Ryan, on priest. I mean, we've seen examples of this actually on both sides already. Bishops rebuking priests who are using their authority to do it, to make a specific public endorsement of a political candidate. So that is problematic because I think, one, it is an abuse of authority because there's a lot of Catholic lay people who will perhaps give a priest teaching on that, what I would consider undue warrant. And it makes it hurts the priest ministry because there are going to be people who can't come to this priest because they're like, oh, well, this priest is voting for Biden, so I don't trust him. So that type of public endorsement, yes, I think is very problematic. However, I would think Augustine, who is also priest and a bishop, is very clear on this, that we don't give up just because we are called to these supernatural ends and these supernatural allegiances. We don't give up our natural duties. And we don't give up, we don't give up having these obligations for priests and justice. And I don't think he thinks ordination removes that. As a matter of fact, given his own engagement in political issues and his mentor Ambrose's engagement in political issues, they don't just wash their hands of it. And let's not forget, of course, that Ambrose goes and rebukes Father Michael. You remember this more than I am, and the Emperor Valentinus, right? I mean, talk about some heavy political engagement. So I do think that would be my response. Okay, Jen's question. When does the endorsement of a candidate become gray area with the endorsement of an issue supported by a particular party? That's a great question. So remember, when you are voting, you are always voting for a person. You're not voting for a platform, because the platform is put together by the whole party. And you're looking at the person, you're not just asking what does the party support, but you're asking about the person's character. And do I think this person, even if I disagree with this person on fundamental issues, is more or less likely to generally advance the common good? And the bishops actually talk about this, and I think I put this up I think this was in the slide I put up. It is a problem for a Catholic it is morally impermissible for a Catholic to vote for a person because they support the issue that is intrinsically evil. Mm-hmm. So you can't do that. But if you have, through prayer and formation of conscience, have decided that given that both parties have parts of their platform that are intrinsically evil, and look, they're very clear, there's a preference on the abortion issue, but that is not the only issue around life. And so you have to do this careful weighing. If you still vote for the person who you think is most likely to advance the common good, even given the platform that relates to intrinsically evil acts, that is the right way to vote. So I think it is a very careful balancing act. Does that answer your question?
And does it, Jen? Because I was going to say, and if it doesn't, we are actually, that's the focus of our last talk on the Sunday before the elections.
It's like
Gosh, it's almost like I knew that, Patrick.
Hey, it's a good segue.
It's almost like you're really good at your job and doing advanced publicity or something.
Yeah.
What? I have never been this good at my job.
Thank you.
Father Brian's comment. Yeah, I think the USCCB document gets you there. I really do. I think it requires some careful reading. But there's also, I will send a link to Father Patrick to send. Notre Dame, Church Life Journal at Notre Dame published a great article called How to Vote Like a Catholic. And the picture on the front is an engraving of someone with a clothespin on his nose.
Great. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks everybody for coming, and
terrific presentation.
Thanks Student Brothers for accepting my teaching once again.
Oh, God bless you.
And thank you, Father, for asking me.
Well, thank you. And then again, back to our upcoming talks. Dr. Steve Millies is going to be back with us again next Sunday, and we're going to go into a deeper dive on the virtue of prudence in our voting. So you've given us a good introduction to that. We're going to go into it in a deeper way next week. And as I said, then the talk in a couple weeks, or the last one, I'm sorry, is going to look more at how do we, when we're voting for a candidate, is it for the candidate, or do we vote on issues? And then before that, so that would be a week and a few days before the election, our brother, Father Charlie Bouchard, is going to be with us. And he's going to be talking on the topic, is there one issue for Catholics in deciding for whom and how we vote? So again, thank you. This will be up, we recorded this, and it'll be up on the Catholic Student Center's website for further viewing. But thank you all for being with us tonight. God bless you all. And again, thank you, Elizabeth, for being with us tonight. Great job.
Thank you.